Being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise. The mind is like an iceberg, it floats with 1/7 of its bulk above water. Flowers are restful to look at. They have neither emotions nor conflicts. The ego is not master in its own house. Every normal person, in fact, is only normal on the average. His ego approximates to that of the psychotic in some part or other and to a greater or lesser extent. Yes, America is gigantic, but a gigantic mistake. Everywhere I go I find that a poet has been there before me. He does not believe that does not live according to his belief. The act of birth is the first experience of anxiety, and thus the source and prototype of the affect of anxiety. The psychical, whatever its nature may be, is itself unconscious. Whoever loves becomes humble. Those who love have, so to speak, pawned a part of their narcissism. Love and work are the cornerstones of our humanness. The psychoanalysis of neurotics has taught us to recognize the intimate connection between wetting the bed and the character trait of ambition. Analysis does not set out to make pathological reactions impossible, but to give the patient's ego freedom to decide one way or another. I have found little that is good about human beings on the whole. In my experience most of them are trash, no matter whether they publicly subscribe to this or that ethical doctrine or to none at all. That is something that you cannot say aloud, or perhaps even think. The liberty of the individual is no gift of civilization. It was greatest before there was any civilization. The conscious mind may be compared to a fountain playing in the sun and falling back into the great subterranean pool of subconscious from which it rises. Neurotics complain of their illness, but they make the most of it, and when it comes to talking it away from them they will defend it like a lioness her young. A man who has been the indisputable favorite of his mother keeps for life the feeling of a conqueror. The tendency to aggression is an innate, independent, instinctual disposition in man. It constitutes the powerful obstacle to culture. Children are completely egoistic. They feel their needs intensely and strive ruthlessly to satisfy them. The great question that has never been answered, and which I have not yet been able to answer, despite my 30 years of research into the feminine soul, is, what does a woman want? The interpretation of dreams is the royal road to a knowledge of the unconscious activities of the mind. What a distressing contrast there is between the radiant intelligence of the child and the feeble mentality of the average adult. Men are more moral than they think and far more immoral than they can imagine. A man should not strive to eliminate his complexes but to get into accord with them. They are legitimately what directs his conduct in the world. Illusions commend themselves to us because they save us pain and allow us to enjoy pleasure instead. We must therefore accept it without complaint when they sometimes collide with a bit of reality against which they are dashed to pieces. If a man has been his mother's undisputed darling, he retains throughout life the triumphant feeling, the confidence in success, which not seldom brings actual success along with it. Opposition is not necessarily enmity, it is merely misused and made an occasion for enmity. Just as a cautious businessman avoids investing all his capital in one concern, so wisdom would probably admonish us also not to anticipate all our happiness from one quarter alone. Men are strong so long as they represent a strong idea. They become powerless when they oppose it. We have long observed that every neurosis has the result, and therefore probably the purpose, of forcing the patient out of real life, of alienating him from actuality. The doctor should be opaque to his patients and, like a mirror, should show them nothing but what is shown to him. We believe that civilization has been created under the pressure of the exigencies of life at the cost of satisfaction of the instincts. Man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. When he puts on all his auxiliary organs, he is truly magnificent, but those organs have not grown on him and they still give him much trouble at times. The goal towards which the pleasure principle impels us, of becoming happy, is not attainable, yet we may not, nay, cannot, give up the efforts to come nearer to realization of it by some means or other. It is impossible to overlook the extent to which civilization is built upon a renunciation of instinct. Religion is an illusion, and it derives its strength from the fact that it falls in with our instinctual desires. I cannot think of any need in childhood as strong as the need for a father's protection. Dreams are often most profound when they seem the most crazy. The voice of the intellect is a soft one, but it does not rest until it has gained a hearing. Love and work, work and love, that's all there is. We are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love. Obviously, one must hold oneself responsible for the evil impulses of one's dreams. In what other way can one deal with them? Unless the content of the dream rightly understood is inspired by alien spirits, it is part of my own being. Most people do not really want freedom, because freedom involves responsibility, and most people are frightened of responsibility. America is the most grandiose experiment the world has seen, but, I am afraid, it is not going to be a success. He that has eyes to see and ears to hear may convince himself that no mortal can keep a secret. If his lips are silent, he chatters with his fingertips, betrayal oozes out of him at every pore. What we call happiness in the strictest sense comes from the, preferably sudden, satisfaction of needs which have been dammed up to a high degree. Just as no one can be forced into belief, so no one can be forced into unbelief. A civilization which leaves so large a number of its participants unsatisfied and drives them into revolt neither has nor deserves the prospect of a lasting existence. The first requisite of civilization is that of justice. The first human who hurled an insult instead of a stone was the founder of civilization. Incidentally, why was it that none of all the pious ever discovered psychoanalysis? Why did it have to wait for a completely godless Jew? What progress we are making! In the Middle Ages they would have burned me. Now they are content with burning my books. A certain degree of neurosis is of inestimable value as a drive, especially to a psychologist. Analogies, it is true, decide nothing, but they can make one feel more at home. Civilization began the first time an angry person cast a word instead of a rock. Like the physical, the psychical is not necessarily in reality what it appears to us to be. Sadism is all right in its place, but it should be directed to proper ends. Civilized society is perpetually menaced with disintegration through this primary hostility of men towards one another. A belligerent state permits itself every such misdeed, every such act of violence, as would disgrace the individual. Men are strong only so long as they represent a strong idea. They become powerless when they oppose it. One feels inclined to say that the intention that man should be happy is not included in the plan of creation. We are so made that we can derive intense enjoyment only from a contrast and very little from a state of things. One feels inclined to say that the intention that man should be happy is not included in the plan of creation. One feels inclined to say that the intention that man should be happy is not included in the plan of creation. I have found little that is good about human beings on the whole. In my experience most of them are trash, no matter whether they publicly subscribe to this or that ethical doctrine or to none at all. That is something that you cannot say aloud, or perhaps even think. I have found little that is good about human beings. In my experience most of them, on the whole, are trash. People are made either to suffer or to destroy. We are threatened with suffering from three directions: from our own body, which is doomed to decay and dissolution and which cannot even do without pain and anxiety as warning signals; from the external world, which may rage against us with overwhelming and merciless forces of destruction; and finally from our relations to other men. The suffering which comes from this last source is perhaps more painful than any other. We hate the criminal and deal severely with him, because we view in his deeds as in a distorting mirror our own criminal tendencies. We are so made that we can derive intense enjoyment from a contrast and very little from a state of things. At the bottom, God is nothing more than an exalted Father. Conscience is the internal perception of the reaction of a particular wish operating within us. The time comes when each one of us has to give up as illusions the expectations which, in his youth, he pinned upon his fellowmen, and when he may learn how much difficulty and pain has been added to his life by their ill will. The tendency of aggression is an innate, independent, instinctual disposition in man. It constitutes the most powerful obstacle to culture. Psychoanalysis is for hysterical pathological cases, not for silly rich American women who should be learning how to darn socks. It seems to be my fate to discover only the obvious, that children have sexual feelings, which every nursemaid knows, and that the night dreams are just as much a wish fulfillment as day dreams. I have yet not been able to answer the great question that has never been answered. What does a woman want? The history of the world which is still taught to our children is essentially a series of race murders. A great part of the pleasure of travel lies in the fulfillment of early wishes to escape the family and especially the father. And in the development of mankind as a whole, just as in individuals, love alone acts as a civilizing factor in the sense that it brings a change from egoism to altruism. The first human being who hurled an insult instead of a stone was the founder of civilization. The first man to use abusive language instead of his fists was the founder of civilization. The first man to use abusive language instead of his fists was the founder of civilization. The interpretation of dreams is the royal road to knowledge of the unconscious activities of the mind. To be sure, the ancient belief that the dream reveals the future is not entirely devoid of truth. By representing to us a wish as fulfilled, the dream certainly leads us into the future, but this future, taken by the dreamer as present, has been formed into the likeness of that past by the indestructible wish. When the wayfarer whistles in the dark, he may be disavowing his timidity, but he does not see any the more clearly for doing so. We know less about the sexual life of little girls than of boys. But we need not feel ashamed of this distinction. After all, the sexual life of adult women is a dark continent for psychology. The pleasure principle long persists, however, as the method of working employed by the sexual instincts, which are so hard to educate, and, starting from those instincts, or in the ego itself, it often succeeds in overcoming the reality principle, to the detriment of the organism as a whole. These patients have turned away from outer reality. It is for this reason that they are more aware than we of inner reality and can reveal to us things which without them would remain impenetrable. No one who, like me, conjures up the most evil of those half-tamed demons that inhabit the human breast, and seeks to wrestle with them, can expect to come through the struggle unscathed. Neither in my private life nor in my writings have I ever made a secret of being an out-and-out unbeliever. Obsessional prohibitions are extremely liable to displacement. They extend from one object to another along whatever paths the context may provide, and this new object then becomes, to use the apt expression of one of my women patients, impossible, till at last the whole world lies under an embargo of impossibility. Only a rebuke that has something in it, will sting, will have the power to stir our feelings, not the other sort, as we know. The transformation of object libido into narcissistic libido which thus takes place obviously implies an abandonment of sexual aims, a desexualization, a kind of sublimation, therefore. A lady once expressed herself in society. The very words show that they were uttered with fervor and under the pressure of a great many secret emotions. Yes, a woman must be pretty if she is to please the men. A man is much better off. As long as he has 5 straight limbs, he needs no more. Dreams are the guardians of sleep and not its disturbers. America is a mistake, admittedly a gigantic mistake, but a mistake nevertheless. If one wishes to form a true estimate of the full grandeur of religion, one must keep in mind what it undertakes to do for men. It gives them information about the source and origin of the universe, it assures them of protection and final happiness, and it guides, by precepts, backed by the full force of its authority. An overwhelming majority of symbols in dreams are sexual symbols. Religious doctrines are all illusions, they do not admit of proof, and no one can be compelled to consider them as true or to believe in them. Immorality, no less than morality, has at all times found support in religion. Writers write for fame, wealth, power and the love of women. Public self is a conditioned construct of the inner psychological self. No neurotic harbors thoughts of suicide which are not murderous impulses against others redirected upon himself. Words and magic were in the beginning one and the same thing, and even today words retain much of their magical power. Christmas is the alcoholidays. The news that reaches your consciousness is incomplete and often not to be relied on. Turn your eyes inward, look into your own depths, learn first to know yourself. Sexual morality, as society in its extreme form, the American, defines it, is contemptible. I advocate an incomparably freer sexual life. What good to us is a long life if it is difficult and barren of joys, and if it is so full of misery that we can only welcome death as a deliverer? Even if all parts of a problem seem to fit together like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, one has to remember that the probable need not necessarily be the truth and the truth not always probable. Might we not say that every child at play behaves like a creative writer, in that he creates a world of his own, or, rather, rearranges the things of his world in a new way which pleases him? I should like to raise the question whether the inevitable stunting of the sense of smell as a result of man's turning away from the earth, and the organic repression of the smell pleasure produced by it, does not largely share in his predisposition to nervous diseases. All the categories which we employ to describe conscious mental acts, such as ideas, purposes, resolutions, and so on, can be applied to these latent states. The inclination to aggression constitutes the greatest impediment to civilization. A collection to which nothing can be added and from which nothing can be removed is, in fact, dead. When a man has once brought himself to accept uncritically all the absurdities that religious doctrines put before him and even to overlook the contradictions between them, we need not be greatly surprised at the weakness of his intellect. My psychoanalysis has equipped you with the equivalent of a train ticket to recovery. It is now your decision whether or not you choose to make full use of it. A string of reproaches against other people leads one to suspect the existence of a string of self-reproaches with the same content. The expectation that every neurotic phenomenon can be cured may, I suspect, be derived from the layman's belief that the neuroses are something quite unnecessary which have no right whatever to exist, whereas in fact they are severe, constitutionally fixed illnesses, which rarely restrict themselves to only a few attacks but persist as a rule over long periods throughout life. An intimate friend and a hated enemy have always been indispensable requirements for my emotional life. I have always been able to create them anew, and not infrequently my childish ideal has been so closely approached that friend and enemy coincided in the same person. Religion restricts the play of choice and adaptation, since it imposes equally on everyone its own path to the acquisition of happiness and protection from suffering. Its technique consists in depressing the value of life and distorting the picture of the real world in a delusional manner, which presupposes an intimidation of the intelligence. At this price, by forcibly fixing them in a state of psychical infantilism and by drawing them into a mass delusion, religion succeeds in sparing many people an individual neurosis. But hardly anything more. Do you not know how uncontrolled and unreliable the average human being is in all that concerns sexual life? We are so made that we can derive intense enjoyment only from a contrast. We are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love, never so forlornly unhappy as when we have lost our love object or its love. Religion belonged to the infancy of humanity. Now that humanity had come of age, it should be left behind. Where ID was, their ego shall be. Creativity is an attempt to resolve a conflict generated by unexpressed biological impulses, such that unfulfilled desires are the driving force of the imagination, and they fuel our dreams and daydreams. One must not be mean with affections. What is spent of the funds is renewed in the spending itself. Left untouched for too long, they diminish imperceptibly or the lock gets rusty. They are there all right, but one cannot make use of them. The only shame in masturbation is the shame of not doing it well. Religion, something comparable to childhood neurosis. The world is no nursery. Another technique for fending off suffering is the employment of the displacements of libido, which are mental apparatus permits of and through which its function gains so much inflexibility. The task here is that of shifting the instinctual aims in such a way that they cannot come up against frustration from the external world. A child in its greed for love does not enjoy having to share the affection of its parents with its brothers and sisters, and it notices that the whole of their affection is lavished upon it once more whenever it arouses their anxiety by falling ill. It has now discovered a means of enticing out its parents' love and will make use of that means as soon as it has the necessary psychical material at its disposal for producing an illness. It is a great injustice to persecute homosexuality as a crime, and cruelty too. I do not think our successes can compete with those of Lourdes. There are so many more people who believe in the miracles of the Blessed Virgin than in the existence of the unconscious. Whatever fosters the growth of civilization works at the same time against war. Now it is nothing but torture. Look into the depths of your own soul and learn first to know yourself. Then you will understand why this illness was bound to come upon you, and perhaps you will thenceforth avoid falling ill. The psychic development of the individual is a short repetition of the course of development of the race. Demons do not exist any more than gods do, being only the products of the psychic activity of man. Cigars served me for precisely 50 years as protection and a weapon in the combat of life. I owe to the cigar a great intensification of my capacity to work and a facilitation of my self-control. I've been a fortunate man in life, nothing has come easily. If there are quarrels between the parents or if their marriage is unhappy, the ground will be prepared in their children for the severest predisposition to a disturbance of sexual development or to neurotic illness. Much of our highly valued cultural heritage has been acquired at the cost of sexuality. A strong egoism is a protection against disease, but in the last resort we must begin to love in order that we may not fall ill, and must fall ill if, in consequence of frustration, we cannot love. I have often felt as though I had inherited all the defiance and all the passions with which our ancestors defended their temple and could gladly sacrifice my life for one great moment in history. And at the same time I always felt so helpless and incapable of expressing these ardent passions even by a word or a poem. The meager satisfaction that man can extract from reality leaves him starving. Civilization runs a greater risk if we maintain our present attitude to religion than if we give it up. Humor is a means of obtaining pleasure in spite of the distressing effects that interface with it. A man like me cannot live without a hobby horse, a consuming passion, in Schiller's words a tyrant. I have found my tyrant, and in his service I know no limits. My tyrant is psychology. It has always been my distant, beckoning goal, and now since I have hit upon the neuroses, it has come so much the nearer. Religion is the universal obsessional neurosis of humanity. The reproaches against science for not having yet solved the problems of the universe are exaggerated in an unjust and malicious manner. It has truly not had time enough yet for these great achievements. Science is very young, a human activity which developed late. Men are not gentle, friendly creatures wishing for love, who simply defend themselves if they are attacked, but a powerful measure of desire for aggression had to be reckoned as part of their instinctual endowment. The impression forces itself upon one that men measure by false standards, that everyone seeks power, success, riches for himself, and admires others who attain them, while undervaluing the truly precious thing in life. It often seems that the poet's derisive comment is not unjustified when he says of the philosopher, "With his nightcaps and the tatters of his dressing gown he patches the gaps in the structure of the universe." The sexual life of adult women is a dark continent for psychology. The moment a man questions the meaning and value of life, he is sick, since objectively neither has any existence. By asking this question, one is merely admitting to a store of unsatisfied libido to which something else must have happened. A kind of fermentation leading to sadness and depression. It would be one of the greatest triumphs of humanity, one of the most tangible liberations from the constraints of nature to which mankind is subject, if we could succeed in raising the responsible act of procreating children to the level of a deliberate and intentional activity and in freeing it from its entanglement with the necessary satisfaction of a natural need. But one thing about human beings puzzles me the most is their conscious effort to be connected with the object of their affection even if it kills them slowly within. The pleasure of satisfying a savage instinct, undomesticated by the ego, is incomparably much more intense than the one of satisfying a tamed instinct. The reason is becoming the enemy that prevents us from a lot of possibilities of pleasure. The genitals themselves have not undergone the development of the rest of the human form in the direction of beauty. The whole life of instinct serves the one end of bringing about death. We may say that hysteria is a caricature of an artistic creation, a compulsion neurosis a caricature of a religion, and a paranoiac delusion a caricature of a philosophic system. An unrestricted satisfaction of every need presents itself as the most enticing method of conducting one's life, but it means putting enjoyment before caution, and soon brings its own punishment. A transference neurosis corresponds to a conflict between ego and ID, a narcissistic neurosis corresponds to that between ego and superego, and a psychosis to that between ego and outer world. I have an infamously low capacity for visualizing relationships, which made the study of geometry and all subjects derived from it impossible for me. Religion is a universal obsessional neurosis. In this way the ego detaches itself from the external world. It is more correct to say, originally the ego includes everything, later it detaches from itself the external world. The ego feeling we are aware of now is thus only a shrunken vestige of a far more extensive feeling, a feeling which embraced the universe and expressed an inseparable connection of the ego with the external world. Perhaps the hopes I have confessed to are of an illusory nature, too. But I hold fast to one distinction. Apart from the fact that no penalty is imposed for not sharing them, my illusions are not, like religious ones, incapable of correction. The motive forces of fantasies are unsatisfied wishes, and every single fantasy is the fulfillment of a wish, a correction of unsatisfying reality. A strong experience in the present awakens in the creative writer a memory of an earlier experience, usually belonging to his childhood, from which there now proceeds a wish, which finds its fulfillment in the creative work. There is an intellectual function in us which demands unity, connection and intelligibility from any material, whether of perception or thought, that comes within its grasp. And if, as a result of special circumstances, it is unable to establish a true connection, it does not hesitate to fabricate a false one. A piece of creative writing, like a daydream, is a continuation of, and a substitute for, what was once the play of childhood. Free sexual intercourse between young males and respectable girls was urgently necessary, or society was doomed to fall a victim to incurable neuroses which reduce the enjoyment of life to a minimum, destroy the marriage relation, and bring hereditary ruin on the whole coming generation. I regard myself as one of the most dangerous enemies of religion. Against the suffering which may come upon one from human relationships, the readiest safeguard is voluntary isolation, keeping oneself aloof from other people. The happiness which can be achieved along this path is, as we see, the happiness of quietness. Against the dreaded external world one can only defend oneself by some kind of turning away from it, if one intends to solve the task by oneself. The idea of life having a purpose stands and falls with the religious system. Hatred of Judaism is at bottom hatred of Christianity. We have become convinced that it is better to avoid such symbolic disguisings of the truth in what we tell children, and not to withhold from them a knowledge of the true state of affairs commensurate with their intellectual level. Religion is an attempt to get control over the sensory world, in which we are placed, by means of the wish world which we have developed inside us as a result of biological and psychological necessities. If one attempts to assign to religion its place in man's evolution, it seems not so much to be a lasting acquisition, as a parallel to the neurosis which the civilized individual must pass through on his way from childhood to maturity. A hero is a man who stands up manfully against his father and in the end victoriously overcomes him. Our knowledge of the historical worth of certain religious doctrines increases our respect for them, but does not invalidate our proposal that they should cease to be put forward as the reasons for the precepts of civilization. On the contrary, those historical residues have helped us to view religious teachings, as it were, as neurotic relics, and we may now argue that the time has probably come, as it does in an analytic treatment, for replacing the effects of repression by the results of the rational operation of the intellect. One might compare the relation of the ego to the ID with that between a rider and his horse. The horse provides the locomotor energy, and the rider has the prerogative of determining the goal and of guiding the movements of his powerful mount towards it. But all too often in the relations between the ego and the ID we find a picture of the less ideal situation in which the rider is obliged to guide his horse in the direction in which it itself wants to go. In the important decisions of personal life, we should be governed by the deep inner needs of our nature. Lead us, Heavenly Father, lead us o'er the world's tempestuous sea, guard us, guide us, keep us, feed us, for we have no help but Thee. Civilization has little to fear from educated people and brain workers. In them the replacement of religious motives for civilized behaviors by other, secular motives, would proceed unobtrusively. No one who has seen a baby sinking back satiated from the breast and falling asleep with flushed cheeks and a blissful smile can escape the reflection that this picture persists as a prototype of the expression of sexual satisfaction in later life. It almost looks like analysis were the third of those impossible professions in which one can be quite sure of unsatisfying results. The other two, much older established, are the bringing up of children and the government of nations. All elongated objects, such as sticks, tree trunks, and umbrellas, the opening of these last being comparable to an erection, may stand for the male organ. Boxes, cases, chests, cupboards, and ovens represent the uterus. Rooms in dreams are usually women, many. Landscapes in dreams, especially any containing braes or wooded hills, may clearly be recognized as descriptions of the genitals. We must reckon with the possibility that something in the nature of the sexual instinct itself is unfavorable to the realization of complete satisfaction. Plaque was placed on May 6, 1977 at Bellevue, a house on the slopes of the Wienerwald, where the Freud family spent their summers. Concerning the factors of silence, solitude and darkness, we can only say that they are actually elements in the production of the infantile anxiety from which the majority of human beings have never become quite free. When someone abuses me I can defend myself, but against praise I am defenseless. I have found little good about human beings. In my experience, most of them are trash. I have never doubted that religious phenomena are only to be understood on the pattern of the individual neurotic symptoms familiar to us. Not all men are worthy of love. The primitive stages can always be re-established. The primitive mind is, in the fullest meaning of the word, imperishable. A man's heterosexuality will not put up with any homosexuality, and vice versa. Our fascination with gold is related to the fantasies of early childhood. I am not aware, however, that patients suffering from traumatic neurosis are much occupied in their waking lives with memories of their accident. Perhaps they are more concerned with not thinking of it. There is no doubt that the resistance of the conscious and unconscious ego operates under the sway of the pleasure principle. It seeks to avoid the unpleasure which would be produced by the liberation of the repressed. What psychoanalysis reveals in the transference phenomena of neurotics can also be observed in the lives of some normal people. The impression they give is of being pursued by a malignant fate or possessed by some demonic power. But psychoanalysis has always taken the view that their fate is for the most part arranged by themselves and determined by early infantile influences. There is scarcely room for doubt that something in the psychological relation of a mother-in-law to a son-in-law breeds hostility between them and makes it hard for them to live together. But the fact that in civilized societies mothers-in-law are such a favorite subject for joke seems to me to suggest that the emotional relation involved includes sharply contrasted components. I believe, that is, that this relation is in fact an ambivalent one, composed of conflicting affectionate and hostile impulses. The facts which have caused us to believe in the dominance of the pleasure principle in mental life also find expression in the hypothesis that the mental apparatus endeavors to keep the quantity of excitation present in it as low as possible, or at least to keep it constant. In the theory of psychoanalysis we have no hesitation in assuming that the course taken by mental events is automatically regulated by the pleasure principle. We believe, that is to say, that the course of those events is invariably set in motion by an unpleasurable tension, and that it takes a direction such that its final outcome coincides with a lowering of that tension, that is, with an avoidance of unpleasure or a production of pleasure. You wanted to kill your father in order to be your father yourself. Now you are your father, but a dead father. It sounds not only disagreeable but also paradoxical, yet it must nevertheless be said that anyone who is to be really free and happy in love must have surmounted his respect for women and have come to terms with the idea of incest with his mother or sister. The state in which the ideas existed before being made conscious is called by us repression, and we assert that the force which instituted the repression and maintains it is perceived as resistance during the work of analysis. But the repressed merges into the ID as well, and is merely a part of it. The repressed is only cut off sharply from the ego by the resistances of repression. It can communicate with the ego through the ID. The functional importance of the ego is manifested in the fact that normally control over the approaches to motility devolves upon it. Thus in its relation to the ID it is like a man on horseback, who has to hold in check the superior strength of the horse, with this difference, that the rider tries to do so with his own strength while the ego uses borrowed forces. The ego is first and foremost a bodily ego. It is not merely a surface entity, but is itself the projection of a surface. If we wish to find an anatomical analogy for it, we can best identify it with the cortical homunculus of the anatomists, which stands on its head in the cortex, sticks up its heels, faces. When it happens that a person has to give up a sexual object, there quite often ensues an alteration of his ego which can only be described as a setting up of the object inside the ego, as it occurs in melancholia. The exact nature of this substitution is as yet unknown to us. Psychoanalysis has taught us that a boy's earliest choice of objects for his love is incestuous and that those objects are forbidden ones, his mother and his sister. We have learnt, too, the manner in which, as he grows up, he liberates himself from this incestuous attraction. A neurotic, on the other hand, invariably exhibits some degree of psychical infantilism. He has either failed to get free from the psychosexual conditions that prevailed in his childhood or he has returned to them, two possibilities which may be summed up as developmental inhibition and regression. There is a powerful force within us, an unilluminated part of the mind, separate from the conscious mind that is constantly at work molding our thought, feelings, and actions. We should picture the instrument that carries our mental functioning as resembling a compound microscope or photographic apparatus. The child receives impressions like a photographic exposure that can be developed after any interval of time and transformed into a picture. Adolescent stage in the development of the human race from which humanity should free itself. I no longer believe that William Shakespeare the actor from Stratford was the author of the works that have been ascribed to him. Man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. These religious ideas are given out as teachings, are not precipitates of experience or end results of thinking, they are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest and most urgent wishes of mankind. Love is a state of temporary psychosis. The three major mother gods of the Eastern populations seem to be generating and destroying entities at the same time, both goddesses of life and fertility as well as goddesses of death. This transmissibility of taboo is a reflection of the tendency, on which we have already remarked, for the unconscious instinct in the neurosis to shift constantly along associative paths onto new objects. In every age immorality has found no less support in religion than morality has. If the achievements of religion in respect to man's happiness, susceptibility to culture and moral control are no better than this, the question cannot but arise whether we are not overrating its necessity for mankind, and whether we do wisely in basing our cultural demands upon it. One must learn to give up momentary, uncertain and destructive pleasure for delayed, restrained, but dependable pleasure. The aim of psychoanalysis is to relieve people of their neurotic unhappiness so that they can be normally unhappy. Crystals reveal their hidden structures only when broken. Dreams are constructed from the residue of yesterday. One becomes gradually accustomed to a new realization of the nature of happiness. One has to assume happiness when fate does not carry out all its threats simultaneously. Words have a magical power. They can either bring the greatest happiness or the deepest despair. The dream is the liberation of the spirit from the pressure of external nature, a detachment of the soul from the fetters of matter. My love is something valuable to me which I ought not to throw away without reflection. There are no mistakes. Where such men love they have no desire, and where they desire they cannot love. Only a good-for-nothing is not interested in his past. The devil would be the best way out as an excuse for God. In that way he would be playing the same part as an agent of economic discharge as the Jew does in the world of the Aryan ideal. But even so, one can hold God responsible for the existence of the devil just as well as for the existence of the wickedness which the devil embodies. Innately, children seem to have little true realistic anxiety. They will run along the brink of water, climb on the window sill, play with sharp objects and with fire, in short, do everything that is bound to damage them and to worry those in charge of them. That is wholly the result of education, for they cannot be allowed to make the instructive experiences themselves. The sexual wishes in regard to the mother become more intense and the father is perceived as an obstacle to them. This gives rise to the Oedipus complex. The view is often defended that sciences should be built up on clear and sharply defined basal concepts. In actual fact, no science, not even the most exact, begins with such definitions. The true beginning of scientific activity consists rather in describing phenomena and then in proceeding to group, classify and correlate them. Dream is the dreamer's own psychical act. Opposition is not necessarily enmity. In the last analysis, the entire field of psychology may reduce to biological electrochemistry. If you want to endure life, prepare yourself for death. The wish to be able to fly is to be understood as nothing else than a longing to be capable of sexual performance. In matters of sexuality we are at present, every one of us, ill or well, nothing but hypocrites. What is common in all these dreams is obvious. They completely satisfy wishes excited during the day which remain unrealized. They are simply and undisguisedly realizations of wishes. If children could, if adults knew. The individual does actually carry on a double existence, one designed to serve his own purposes and another as a link in a chain, in which he serves against, or at any rate without, any volition of his own. The effect of the consolations of religion may be compared to that of a narcotic. A love that does not discriminate seems to me to forfeit a part of its own value, by doing an injustice to its object, and secondly, not all men are worthy of love. The idea of men's receiving an intimation of their connection with the world around them through an immediate feeling which is from the outset directed to that purpose sounds so strange and fits in so badly with the fabric of our psychology that one is justified in attempting to discover a psychoanalytic, that is, a genetic, explanation of such a feeling. Pathology has made us acquainted with a great number of states in which the boundary lines between the ego and the external world become uncertain or in which they are actually drawn incorrectly. There are cases in which parts of a person's own body, even portions of his own mental life, his perceptions, thoughts and feelings appear alien to him and as not belonging to his ego. There are other cases in which he ascribes to the external world things that clearly originate in his own ego and that ought to be acknowledged by it. The assumption that everything past is preserved holds good even in mental life only on condition that the organ of the mind has remained intact and that its tissues have not been damaged by trauma or inflammation. But destructive influences which can be compared to causes of illness like these are never lacking in the history of a city, even if it has had a less checkered past than Rome, and even if, like London, it has hardly ever suffered from the visitations of an enemy. Loneliness and darkness have just robbed me of my valuables. It is no wonder if, under the pressure of these possibilities of suffering, men are accustomed to moderate their claims to happiness, just as the pleasure principle itself, indeed, under the influence of the external world, changed into the more modest reality principle. If a man thinks himself happy merely to have escaped unhappiness or to have survived his suffering, and if in general the task of avoiding suffering pushes that of obtaining pleasure into the background. In mourning it is the world which has become poor and empty, in melancholia it is the ego itself. Instinct of love toward an object demands a mastery to obtain it, and if a person feels they can't control the object or feel threatened by it, they act negatively toward it. To endure life remains, when all is said, the first duty of all living being. Illusion can have no value if it makes this more difficult for us. A strong egoism is a protection. The defense against childish helplessness is what lends its characteristic features to the adult's reaction to the helplessness which he has to acknowledge, a reaction which is precisely the formation of religion. Religion originates in the child's and young mankind's fears and need for help. It cannot be otherwise. Love cannot be much younger than the lust for murder. I had thought about cocaine in a kind of daydream. The analytic psychotherapist thus has a threefold battle to wage, in his own mind against the forces which seek to drag him down from the analytic level, outside the analysis, against opponents who dispute the importance he attaches to the sexual instinctual forces and hinder him from making use of them in his scientific technique, and inside the analysis, against his patients, who at first behave like opponents but later on reveal the overvaluation of sexual life which dominates them, and who try to make him captive to their socially untamed passion. Where they love they do not desire, and where they desire they do not love. Only the real, rare, true scientific minds can endure doubt, which is attached to all our knowledge. The only person with whom you have to compare ourselves is that you in the past. And the only person better you should be, this is who you are now. He sido un hombre afortunado en la vida, nada me ha sido fácil. I've been a fortunate man in life, nothing has come easy. The time comes when each of us has to give up as illusions the expectations which, in his youth, he pinned upon his fellow men, and when he may learn how much difficulty and pain has been added to his life by their ill will. Long ago man formed an ideal conception of omnipotence and omniscience which he embodied in his gods. Whatever seemed unattainable to his desires, or forbidden to him, he attributed to these gods. Now he has himself approached very near to realizing this ideal. He has nearly become a god himself. It is unreasonable to expect science to produce a system of ethics. Ethics are a kind of highway code for traffic among mankind, and the fact that in physics atoms which were yesterday assumed to be square are now assumed to be round is exploited with unjustified tendentiousness by all who are hungry for faith. So long as physics extends our dominion over nature, these changes ought to be a matter of complete indifference to you. Intelligence will be used in the service of the neurosis. Perception is less of a recording system and more of a protection system against external stimuli. It is always possible to bind together a considerable number of people in love, so long as there are other people left over to receive the manifestations of their aggressiveness. At first the analyzing physician could do no more than discover the unconscious material that was concealed from the patient, put it together, and, at the right moment, communicate it to him. Psychoanalysis was then first and foremost an art of interpreting. Since this did not solve the therapeutic problem, a further aim quickly came in view, to oblige the patient to confirm the analyst's construction from his own memory. The price we pay for our advance in civilization is a loss of happiness through the heightening of the sense of guilt. If all the evidence put forward for the authenticity of religious teachings originates in the past, it is natural to look round and see whether the present, about which it is easier to form judgments, may not also be able to furnish evidence of the sort. If by this means we could succeed in clearing even a single portion of the religious system from doubt, the whole of it would gain enormously in credibility. The psychoanalysis of individual human beings, however, teaches us with quite special insistence that the God of each of them is formed in the likeness of his Father, that his personal relation to God depends on his relation to his Father in the flesh and oscillates and changes along with that relation, and that at bottom God is nothing other than an exalted Father. Psychiatry is the art of teaching people how to stand on their own feet while reclining on couches. The communal life of human beings had a twofold foundation: the compulsion to work, which was created by external necessity, and the power of love. Perhaps the gods are kind to us, by making life more disagreeable as we grow older. In the end, death seems less intolerable than the manifold burdens we carry. The division of the psychical into what is conscious and what is unconscious is the fundamental premise of psychoanalysis, and it alone makes it possible for psychoanalysis to understand the pathological processes in mental life, which are as common as they are important. and to find a place for them in the framework of science. At bottom, God is nothing more than an exalted Father. Talk therapy turns hysterical misery to mundane unhappiness. Religion is the process of unconscious wish fulfillment, where, for certain people, if the process did not take place it would put them in self-danger of coming to mental harm, being unable to cope with the idea of a godless, purposeless life. Man's most disagreeable habits and idiosyncrasies, his deceit, his cowardice, his lack of reverence, are engendered by his incomplete adjustment to a complicated civilization. It is the result of the conflict between our instincts and our culture. The unconscious, that is to say, the repressed, offers no resistance whatever to the efforts of the treatment. Indeed, it itself has no other endeavor than to break through the pressure weighing down on it and force its way either to consciousness or to a discharge through some real action. The great majority of people have a strong need for authority which they can admire, to which they can submit, and which dominates and sometimes even ill-treats them. One thing only do I know for certain, and that is that man's judgments of value follow directly his wishes for happiness, that, accordingly, they are an attempt to support his illusions with arguments. Page 111. It could be ventured to understand obsessive-compulsive neurosis as the pathological counterpart of religious development, to define neurosis as an individual religiosity, to define religion as a universal obsessive-compulsive neurosis. So in every individual the two trends, one towards personal happiness and the other unity with the rest of humanity, must contend with each other. Where questions of religion are concerned, people are guilty of every possible sort of dishonesty and intellectual misdemeanor. Homosexuality is assuredly no advantage, but it is nothing to be ashamed of, no vice, no degradation. It cannot be classified as an illness. We consider it to be a variation of the sexual function, produced by a certain arrest of sexual development. Many highly respectable individuals of ancient and modern times have been homosexuals, several of the greatest men among them, Plato, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, etc. It is a great injustice to persecute homosexuality as a crime and a cruelty, too. If you do not believe me, read the books of Havelock Ellis. That which we can't remember, we will repeat. If you can't do it, give up. Religion is a system of wishful illusions together with a disavowal of reality, such as we find nowhere else but in a state of blissful hallucinatory confusion. Religion's 11th commandment is thou shalt not question. Religion is comparable to a childhood neurosis. The dream unites the grossest contradictions, permits impossibilities, sets aside the knowledge that influences us by day, and exposes us as ethically and morally obtuse. The very emphasis of the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," makes it certain that we are descended from an endlessly long chain of generations of murderers, whose love of murder was in their blood as it is perhaps also in ours. It must be pointed out, however, that strictly speaking it is incorrect to talk of the dominance of the pleasure principle over the course of mental processes. If such a dominance existed, the immense majority of our mental processes would have to be accompanied by pleasure or to lead to pleasure, whereas universal experience completely contradicts any such conclusion. What is characteristic of illusions is that they are derived from human wishes. It is not so much that man is a herd animal, but that he is a horde animal led by a chief. No other technique for the conduct of life attaches the individual so firmly to reality as laying emphasis on work, for his work at least gives him a secure place in a portion of reality, in the human community. The child takes his play very seriously and he expends large amounts of emotion on it. The opposite of play is not what is serious but what is real. The game replaces sexual enjoyment by pleasure in movement. If youth knew, if age could. Thinking is an experimental dealing with small quantities of energy, just as a general moves miniature figures over a map before setting his troops in action. I think that it is a good plan to bear in mind that people were in the habit of dreaming before there was such a thing as psychoanalysis. The paranoid is never entirely mistaken. Poets are masters of us ordinary men, in knowledge of the mind, because they drink at streams which we have not yet made accessible to science. We are so constituted that we can gain intense pleasure only from the contrast, and only very little from the condition itself. The more the fruits of knowledge become accessible to men, the more widespread is the decline of religious belief. The ego refuses to be distressed by the provocations of reality, to let itself be compelled to suffer. It insists that it cannot be affected by the traumas of the external world. It shows, in fact, that such traumas are no more than occasions for it to gain pleasure. Anxiety in children is originally nothing other than an expression of the fact they are feeling the loss of the person they love. All that matters is love and work. I am actually not at all a man of science, not an observer, not an experimenter, not a thinker. I am by temperament nothing but a conquistador. I like to avoid concessions to faint-heartedness. One can never tell where that road may lead one gives way first in words, and then little by little in substance too. Once again, only religion can answer the question of the purpose of life. One can hardly be wrong in concluding that the idea of life having a purpose stands and falls with the religious system. One must not be mean with the affections. What is spent of the fund is renewed in the spending itself. Human life in common is only made possible when a majority comes together which is stronger than any separate individual and which remains united against all separate individuals. The power of this community is then set up as right in opposition to the power of the individual, which is condemned as brute force. As regards intellectual work, it remains a fact, indeed, that great decisions in the realm of thought and momentous discoveries and solutions of problems are only possible to an individual working in solitude. What is a totem? It is as a rule an animal, whether edible and harmless or dangerous and feared, and more rarely a plant or a natural phenomenon, such as rain or water, which stands in a peculiar relation to the whole clan. In the first place, the totem is the common ancestor of the clan, at the same time it is their guardian spirit and helper, which sends them oracles and, if dangerous to others, recognizes and spares its own children. It is impossible to escape the impression that people commonly use false standards of measurement, that they seek power, success and wealth for themselves and admire them in others, and that they underestimate what is of true value in life. Cruelty and intolerance to those who do not belong to it are natural to every religion. I do not in the least underestimate bisexuality. I expect it to provide all further enlightenment. In some place in my soul, in a very hidden corner, I am a fanatical Jew. I am very much astonished to discover myself as such in spite of all efforts to be unprejudiced and impartial. What can I do against it at my age? In almost every place where we find totems we also find a law against persons of the same totem having sexual relations with one another and consequently against their marrying. This, then, is exogamy, an institution related to totemism. Toward the person who has died we adopt a special attitude, something like admiration for someone who has accomplished a very difficult task. When we attempt to imagine death, we perceive ourselves as spectators. 1. Gets an impression that civilization is something which was imposed on a resisting majority by a minority which understood how to obtain possession of the means to power and coercion. It is, of course, natural to assume that these difficulties are not inherent in the nature of civilization itself but are determined by the imperfections of the cultural forms which have so far been developed. The Mosaic religion had been a father religion, Christianity became a son religion. The old God, the Father, took second place, Christ, the Son, stood in his stead, just as in those dark times every son had longed to do. I was making frequent use of cocaine at that time. I had been the first to recommend the use of cocaine, in 1885, and this recommendation had brought serious reproaches down on me. Love and work and love, that's all there is. I do not doubt that it would be easier for fate to take away your suffering than it would for me. But you will see for yourself that much has been gained if we succeed in turning your hysterical misery into common unhappiness. History is just new people making old mistakes. Intolerance of groups is often, strangely enough, exhibited more strongly against small differences than against fundamental ones. A woman should soften but not weaken a man. The dream acts as a safety valve for the overburdened brain. No matter how much restriction civilization imposes on the individual, he nevertheless finds some way to circumvent it. Wit is the best safety valve modern man has evolved. The more civilization, the more repression, the more need there is for wit. One feels inclined to say that the intention that man should be happy is not included in the plan of creation. We are so made that we can derive intense enjoyment only from a contrast and very little from a state of things. The most ancient and important taboo prohibitions are the two basic laws of totemism. Not to kill the totem animal and to avoid sexual intercourse with members of the totem clan of the opposite sex. A state of consciousness is characteristically very transitory. An idea that is conscious now is no longer so a moment later, although it can become so again under certain conditions that are easily brought about. When a love relationship is at its height, there is no room left for any interest in the environment. A pair of lovers are sufficient to themselves. My way of working was different years ago. I used to wait until an idea came to me. Now I go halfway to meet it, though I don't know whether I find it any the quicker. Our unconscious, then, does not believe in its own death. It behaves as if it were immortal. It knows nothing that is negative, in it contradictories coincide. This may be the secret of heroism. Men have gained control over the forces of nature to such an extent that with their help they would have no difficulty exterminating one another to the last man. They know this, and hence comes a large part of their current unrest, their unhappiness, and their mood of anxiety. The poor ego has a still harder time of it. It has to serve three harsh masters, and it has to do its best to reconcile the claims and demands of all three. The three tyrants are the external world, the superego, and the ID. The goal of all life is death. Smoking is indispensable if one has nothing to kiss. The fateful question for the human species seems to me to be whether and to what extent their cultural development will succeed in mastering the disturbance of their communal life by the human instinct of aggression and self-destruction. One thing only do I know for certain, and that is that man's judgments of value follow directly from his whys for happiness, that, accordingly, they are an attempt to support his illusions with arguments. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. It might be said of psychoanalysis that if you give it your little finger it will soon have your whole hand. There is no likelihood of our being able to suppress humanity's aggressive tendencies. Complete suppression of man's aggressive tendencies is not an issue. What we may try is to direct it into a channel other than that of warfare. Thinking in pictures is, therefore, only a very incomplete form of becoming conscious. In some way, too, it stands nearer to unconscious processes than does thinking in words, and it is unquestionably older than the latter both ontogenetically and phylogenetically. No, our science is no illusion. But an illusion it would be to suppose that what science cannot give us we can get elsewhere. The voice of reason is small, but very persistent. Love in the form of longing and deprivation lowers the self-regard. A father's death is the most important event, the more heartbreaking and poignant loss in a man's life. The study of dreams may be considered the most trustworthy method of investigating deep mental processes. Now, dreams occurring in traumatic neuroses have the characteristic of repeatedly bringing the patient back into the situation of his accident, a situation from which he wakes up in another fright. In the development of mankind as a whole, just as in individuals, love alone acts as the civilizing factor in the sense that it brings a change from egoism to altruism. Sexuality is the key to the problem of the psychoneuroses and of the neuroses in general. No one who disdains the key will ever be able to unlock the door. The ego represents what we call reason and sanity, in contrast to the ID which contains the passions. Towards the outside, at any rate, the ego seems to maintain clear and sharp lines of demarcation. There is only one state, admittedly an unusual state, but not one that can be stigmatized as pathological, in which it does not do this. At the height of being in love, the boundary between ego and object threatens to melt away. Against all the evidence of his senses, a man who is in love declares that I and you are one, and is prepared to behave as if it were a fact. Taboo restrictions are distinct from religious or moral prohibitions. They are not based upon any divine ordinance, but may be said to impose themselves on their own account. They differ from moral prohibitions in that they fall into no system that declares quite generally that certain abstinences must be observed and gives reasons for that necessity. It would be very nice if there were a God who created the world and was a benevolent providence, and if there were a moral order in the universe and an afterlife. But it is a very striking fact that all this is exactly as we are bound to wish it to be. A religion, even if it calls itself a religion of love, must be hard and unloving to those who do not belong to it. Religious ideas have sprung from the same need as all the other achievements of culture, from the necessity for defending itself against the crushing supremacy of nature. Life as we find it is too hard for us, it entails too much pain, too many disappointments, impossible tasks. We cannot do without palliative remedies. Every man has a right over his own life, and war destroys lives that were full of promise. It forces the individual into situations that shame his manhood, obliging him to murder fellow men, against his will. Woe to you, my princess, when I come. I will kiss you quite red and feed you till you are plump. And if you are froward, you shall see who is the stronger, a gentle little girl who doesn't eat enough, or a big wild man who has cocaine in his body. A love letter from Freud to his fiancée. It is easy to see that the ego is that part of the ID which has been modified by the direct influence of the external world. The behavior of a human being in sexual matters is often a prototype for the whole of his other modes of reaction in life. I no longer count as one of my merits that I always tell the truth as much as possible. It has become my métier. If the truth of religious doctrines is dependent on an inner experience that bears witness to the truth, what is one to make of the many people who do not have that experience? The different religions have never overlooked the part played by the sense of guilt in civilization. What is more, they come forward with a claim to save mankind from this sense of guilt, which they call sin. Experience teaches that for most people there is a limit beyond which their constitution cannot comply with the demands of civilization. All who wish to reach a higher standard than their constitution will allow, fall victims to neurosis. It would have been better for them if they could have remained less perfect. I cannot face the idea of life without work. What would one do when ideas failed or words refused to come? It is impossible not to shudder at the thought. The rest of our inquiry is made easy because this God-Creator is openly called Father. Psychoanalysis concludes that he really is the Father, clothed in the grandeur in which he once appeared to the small child. This is one race of people for whom psychoanalysis is of no use whatsoever. How bold one gets when one is sure of being loved. In general, people experience their present naively, as it were, without being able to form an estimate of its contents. They have first to put themselves at a distance from it. The present, that is to say, must have become the past, before it can yield points of vantage from which to judge the future. We must not allow ourselves to be deflected by the feminists who are anxious to force us to regard the two sexes as completely equal in position and worth. Knowledge is the intellectual manipulation of carefully verified observations. Thus we arrive at the singular conclusion that of all the information passed by our cultural assets, it is precisely the elements which might be of the greatest importance to us and which have the task of solving the riddles of the universe and of reconciling us to the sufferings of life. It is precisely those elements that are the least well authenticated of any. In the long run, nothing can withstand reason and experience, and the contradiction religion offers to both is palpable. The voice of the intellect is soft one, but it does not rest until it has gained a hearing. Ultimately, after endless rebuffs, it succeeds. This is one of the few points in which one may be optimistic about the future of mankind. Nature delights in making use of the same forms in the most various biological connections, as it does, for instance, in the appearance of branch-like structures both in coral and in plants, and indeed in some forms of crystal and in certain chemical precipitates. The essence of analysis is surprise. When people are themselves surprised by what they say, that's when they are really making some progress. The price of civilization is instinctual renunciation. The virtuous man contents himself with dreaming that which the wicked man does in actual life. The religions of mankind must be classed among the mass delusions of this kind. No one, needless to say, who shares a delusion ever recognizes it as such. The adoption of the required attitude of mind towards ideas that seem to emerge of their own free will and the abandonment of the critical function that is normally in operation against them seem to be hard of achievement for some people. The involuntary thoughts are liable to release a most violent resistance, which seeks to prevent their emergence. If we may trust that great poet and philosopher Friedrich Schiller, however, poetic creation must demand an exactly similar attitude. After all, we did not invent symbolism. It is a universal age-old activity of the human imagination. As everyone knows, the ancients before Aristotle did not consider the dream a product of the dreaming mind, but a divine inspiration. And in ancient times the two antagonistic streams, which one finds throughout in the estimates of dream life, were already noticeable. They distinguished between true and valuable dreams, sent to the dreamer to warn him or to foretell the future, and vain, fraudulent, and empty dreams, the object of which was to misguide or lead him to destruction. A layman will no doubt find it hard to understand how pathological disorders of the body and mind can be eliminated by mere words. He will feel that he is being asked to believe in magic. And he will not be so very wrong, for the words which we use in our everyday speech are nothing other than watered-down magic. But we shall have to follow a roundabout path in order to explain how science sets about restoring to words a part at least of their former magical power. There is to my mind no doubt that the concept of beautiful had its roots in sexual excitation and that its original meaning was sexually stimulating. It is unavoidable that if we learn more about a great man's life, we shall also hear of occasions on which he has done no better than we, and has in fact come nearer to us as a human being. The whole thing, religion, is so patently infantile, so foreign to reality, that to anyone with a friendly attitude to humanity it is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view of life. Tobacco is the only excuse for Columbus's misadventure in discovering America. I consider it a good rule for letter writing to leave unmentioned what the recipient already knows, and instead tell him something new. There is a psychological technique which makes it possible to interpret dreams, and, if that procedure is employed, every dream reveals itself as a psychical structure which has a meaning and which can be inserted at an assignable point in the mental activities of waking life. In human beings, pure masculinity or femininity is not to be found either in a psychological or biological sense. All family life is organized around the most damaged person in it. You can always make a lot of people love one another so long as there are a smaller number outside the group for them to kick. What decides the purpose of life is simply the program of the pleasure principle. This principle dominates the operation of the mental apparatus from the start. There can be no doubt about its efficacy, and yet its program is at loggerheads with the whole world, with the macrocosm as much as with the microcosm. Desire presses ever forward unsubdued. Neurosis is the result of a conflict between the ego and its ID, whereas psychosis is the analogous outcome of a similar disturbance in the relation between the ego and the external world. It is a predisposition of human nature to consider an unpleasant idea untrue, and then it is easy to find arguments against it. The Irish are the one race for which psychoanalysis is of no use whatsoever, because they already live in a dream world. Religious illusion must bow to scientific truth. It is in total error about the nature of the true world. Only science is not an illusion. But the less a man knows about the past and the present, the more insecure must prove to be his judgment of the future. The only unnatural sexual behavior is none at all. If it's not one thing, it's your mother. Were we fully to understand the reasons for other people's behavior, it would all make sense. In so doing, the idea forces itself upon him that religion is comparable to a childhood neurosis, and he is optimistic enough to suppose that mankind will surmount this neurotic phase, just as so many children grow out of their similar neurosis. Psychoanalysis is in essence a cure through love. Writing was in its origin the voice of an absent person. I have no concern with any economic criticisms of the communist system. I cannot inquire into whether the abolition of private property is expedient or advantageous. But I am able to recognize that the psychological premises on which the system is based are an untenable illusion. In abolishing private property, we deprive the human love of aggression of one of its instruments. But we have in no way altered the differences in power and influence which are misused by aggressiveness. We must love or we grow ill. By abolishing private property one takes away the human love of aggression. A poor girl may have an illusion that a prince will come and fetch her home. It is possible, some such cases have occurred. That the Messiah will come and found a golden age is much less probable. We find a place for what we lose. Although we know that after such a loss the acute stage of mourning will subside, we also know that we shall remain inconsolable and will never find a substitute. No matter what may fill the gap, even if it be filled completely, it nevertheless remains something else. The most complicated achievements of thought are possible without the assistance of consciousness. The unconscious of one human being can react upon that of another without passing through the conscious. Maturity is the ability to postpone gratification. It is a mistake to believe that science consists in nothing but conclusively proved propositions, and it is unjust to demand that it should. It is a demand made by those who feel a craving for authority in some form to replace the religious catechism by something else, even a scientific one. One is very crazy when in love. Not to know the past is to be in bondage to it, while to remember, to know, is to be set free. Beauty has no obvious use, nor is there any clear cultural necessity for it. Yet civilization could not do without it. Philosophers stretch the meaning of words until they retain scarcely anything of their original sense. They give the name of God to some vague abstraction which they have created for themselves. Having done so they can pose before all the world as deists, as believers of God, and they can even boast that they have recognized a higher, purer concept of God, notwithstanding that their God is nothing more than an insubstantial shadow and no longer the mighty personality of religious doctrines. America is a mistake, a giant mistake. None believes in his own death. In the unconscious everyone is convinced of his own immortality. In the small matters trust the mind, in the large ones the heart. Properly speaking, the unconscious is the real psychic. Its inner nature is just as unknown to us as the reality of the external world, and it is just as imperfectly reported to us through the data of consciousness as is the external world through the indications of our sensory organs. Dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. When we share, that is poetry in the prose of life. Two hallmarks of a healthy life are the abilities to love and to work. Each requires imagination. Life, as we find it, is too hard for us. It brings us too many pains, disappointments and impossible tasks. In order to bear it we cannot dispense with palliative measures. There are perhaps three such measures, powerful deflections, which cause us to make light of our misery, substitutive satisfactions, which diminish it, and intoxicating substances, which make us insensible to it. Just as a satisfaction of instinct spells happiness for us, so severe suffering is caused us if the external world lets us starve, if it refuses to sate our needs. One may therefore hope to be freed from a part of one's sufferings by influencing the instinctual impulses. Let us consider the polarity of love and hate. Now, clinical observation shows not only that love is with unexpected regularity accompanied by hate, ambivalence, and not only that in human relationships hate is frequently a forerunner of love, but also that in many circumstances hate changes into love and love into hate. In the depths of my heart I can't help being convinced that my dear fellow men, with a few exceptions, are worthless. It is not attention that the child is seeking, but love. I cannot face with comfort the idea of life without work. Work and the free play of the imagination are for me the same thing. I take no pleasure in anything else. Time spent with cats is never wasted. We may insist as often as we like that man's intellect is powerless in comparison to his instinctual life, and we may be right in this. Nevertheless, there is something peculiar about this weakness. The voice of the intellect is a soft one, but it will not rest until it has gained a hearing. Finally, after a countless succession of rebuffs, it succeeds. Conservatism, however, is too often a welcome excuse for lazy minds, loath to adapt themselves to fast-changing conditions. Conscience is the internal perception of the rejection of a particular wish operating within us. All giving is asking, and all asking is an asking for love. When making a decision of minor importance, I have always found it advantageous to consider all the pros and cons. In vital matters, however, such as the choice of a mate or a profession, the decision should come from the unconscious, from somewhere within ourselves. In the important decisions of personal life, we should be governed, I think, by the deep inner needs of our nature. Indeed, the great Leonardo da Vinci remained like a child for the whole of his life in more than one way. It is said that all great men are bound to retain some infantile part. Even as an adult he continued to play, and this was another reason why he often appeared uncanny and incomprehensible to his contemporaries. The creative writer does the same as the child at play. He creates a world of fantasy which he takes very seriously. When inspiration does not come to me, I go halfway to meet it. Dogs love their friends and bite their enemies, quite unlike people, who are incapable of pure love and always have to mix love and hate. There is little that gives children greater pleasure than when a grown-up lets himself down to their level, renounces his oppressive superiority and plays with them as an equal. From error to error one discovers the entire truth. Civilized people have exchanged some part of their chances of happiness for a measure of security. The intention that man should be happy is not in the plan of creation. If you want your wife to listen to you, then talk to another woman, she will be all ears. When one does not have what one wants, one must want what one has. The madman is a dreamer awake. I had the greatest respect for the authorities of my day until I studied things for myself, and came to my own conclusions. Civilization is a process in the service of Eros, whose purpose is to combine single human individuals, and after that families, then races, peoples and nations, into one great unity, the unity of mankind. Why this has to happen, we do not know. The work of Eros is precisely this. Our possibilities of happiness are already restricted by our constitution. Unhappiness is much less difficult to experience. We are threatened with suffering from three directions: from our own body, which is doomed to decay and dissolution and which cannot even do without pain and anxiety as warning signals; from the external world, which may rage against us with overwhelming and merciless forces of destruction; and finally from our relations to other men. The suffering which comes from this last source is perhaps more painful to us than any other. We are what we are because we have been what we have been. Neurosis is the inability to tolerate ambiguity. Humanity is in the highest degree irrational, so that there is no prospect of influencing it by reasonable arguments. Against prejudice one can do nothing. Where does a thought go when it's forgotten? I became aware of my destiny, to belong to the critical minority as opposed to the unquestioning majority. To be completely honest with oneself is the very best effort a human being can make. My boy, smoking is one of the greatest and cheapest enjoyments in life, and if you decide in advance not to smoke, I can only feel sorry for you. Words have a magical power. They can bring either the greatest happiness or deepest despair. They can transfer knowledge from teacher to student. Words enable the orator to sway his audience and dictate its decisions. Words are capable of arousing the strongest emotions and prompting all men's actions. When a man is freed of religion, he has a better chance to live a normal and wholesome life. The gods retain their threefold task. They must exorcise the terrors of nature, they must reconcile men to the cruelty of fate, particularly as it is shown in death, and they must compensate them for the sufferings and privations which a civilized life in common has imposed on them. A fear of weapons is a sign of retarded sexual and emotional maturity. The true believer is in a high degree protected against the danger of certain neurotic afflictions. By accepting the universal neurosis, he is spared the task of forming a personal neurosis. The poets and philosophers before me discovered the unconscious. What I discovered was the scientific method by which the unconscious can be studied. I prefer the company of animals more than the company of humans. Certainly, a wild animal is cruel. But to be merciless is the privilege of civilized humans. Out of your vulnerabilities will come your strength. Without love we fall ill. One day, in retrospect, the years of struggle will strike you as the most beautiful. Human beings are funny. They long to be with the person they love but refuse to admit openly. Some are afraid to show even the slightest sign of affection because of fear. Fear that their feelings may not be recognized, or even worse, returned. But one thing about human beings puzzles me the most is their conscious effort to be connected with the object of their affection even if it kills them slowly within. We choose not randomly each other. We meet only those who already exists in our subconscious. Unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways.